What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of What Happened. Today, we're diving into a story that literally set Mexico on fire and sent shockwaves around the world. Picture this. It's February 22nd, 2026, and in the span of 24 hours, Mexico goes from relative calm to absolute chaos. We're talking about burning buses, blocked highways across 20 states, airports in panic, and an entire country holding its breath. This is the story of how the death of one man triggered what might be the most intense wave of violence Mexico has seen in years. And that man was Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, the most powerful drug lord in Mexico and one of the most wanted criminals on the planet. If you've never heard of El Mencho before today, you're about to understand why his death made international headlines and why the Mexican government is now dealing with what some are calling a national security crisis just months before hosting the World Cup. Let's start from the beginning. Nemesio Oseguera. Cervantes wasn't born into a life of crime. Actually, his story is almost the opposite. He grew up in Aguililla, Michoacán, a small town of fewer than 20,000 people that's famous for one thing: avocados. His parents were farm workers, and El Mencho dropped out of school after 6th grade to pick avocados alongside them. But somewhere along the way, this farm kid decided he wanted more than what rural Mexico could offer. In the 1990s, he made his way to the United States and started dealing drugs in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is where the El Mencho story really begins, because it was in a San Francisco bar called the Imperial Bar in 1992, where he sold heroin to 2 undercover agents and got himself arrested. He served more than 4 years in federal prison and was then deported back to Mexico. But instead of going back to picking avocados, El Mencho took everything he'd learned about the drug trade in the US and decided to build his own empire back home. Around 2009, El Mencho founded what would become known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. And this wasn't just another drug cartel, this was something completely different. While other cartels focused on traditional trafficking routes, El Mencho had a vision that was way more ambitious and way more violent. The CJNG became known for 3 things that made them absolutely terrifying. First, they weren't just moving cocaine and heroin, they were pumping massive quantities of fentanyl into the United States, contributing to an overdose crisis that kills over 100,000 Americans every year. Second, they diversified way beyond drugs. We're talking about human trafficking, extortion, fuel theft, and basically any criminal enterprise you can imagine. And third, this is the part that made El Mencho legendary in the worst possible way. They pioneered new levels of violence that shocked even other cartels. These guys weren't just carrying guns. They were using military-grade weapons, launching explosives from drones, and even shooting down military helicopters. In 2015, they actually brought down a Mexican Army helicopter in Jalisco using rocket-propelled grenades. They were installing landmines and basically turning parts of Mexico into war zones. But El Mencho's most infamous moment came in 2020 when his cartel attempted to assassinate Omar Garcia Harfuch, then Mexico City's police chief and now the country's federal security secretary. Picture this: broad daylight in Mexico City, and suddenly there are grenades exploding and high-powered rifles firing as cartel members try to take out one of the country's top law enforcement officials. The attack failed, but it sent a clear message: nobody was safe, nowhere was off limits. By 2026, the CJNG had become what the DEA called one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico, with presence in all 50 U.S. states. The U.S. government had a $15 million bounty on El Mencho's head, one of the highest rewards ever offered for a criminal. And in February 2025, the Trump administration did something unprecedented. They designated the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization, putting them in the same category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So, when I tell you that El Mencho was the biggest target in Mexico's war on cartels, I'm not exaggerating. This was the guy that both the Mexican and U.S. governments wanted more than anyone else. And for years, he stayed one step ahead of authorities, protected by a network of safe houses, corrupt officials, and an army of loyal sicarios. But on February 20th, 2026, Mexican intelligence finally got the break they'd been waiting for. They had been tracking El Mencho's network for months, and they identified what they called a trusted man, connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners. This person led them to a cabin complex on the outskirts of Tapalpa, a small tourist town in Jalisco about 2 hours southwest of Guadalajara. Here's where the story gets really intense. Mexican Defense Secretary Ricardo Trevilla later revealed exactly how the operation went down. On February 20th, they got intelligence about El Mencho's location, and on February 21st, they watched as El Mencho's partner left the cabin. But the drug lord himself stayed behind with his security detail. Mexican forces knew this might be their only chance. So on Sunday morning, February 22nd, they launched what they called a joint operation involving multiple branches of Mexico's military. We're talking about the Mexican Army, the National Guard, the Air Force, and Special Reaction Forces. All working together with intelligence support from the United States, they established a perimeter around the complex and then moved in. But El Mencho didn't go down without a fight. When Mexican forces closed in, his security team opened fire with everything they had. The resulting firefight was absolutely brutal. 4 of El Mencho's operatives were killed on the spot. The cartel leader himself, along with 2 bodyguards, was seriously wounded as they tried to flee into the surrounding woods. Mexican forces managed to capture the wounded men, and they immediately began flying El Mencho to Mexico City for medical treatment. But he was too badly injured. Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, the most wanted man in Mexico, died during that helicopter flight to the capital. Now, here's where this story goes from a successful military operation to an absolute nightmare. Because the moment news of El Mencho's death spread through the CJNG's network, all hell broke loose across Mexico. Within hours, suspected cartel members began what can only be described as a coordinated campaign of terror. They started setting vehicles on fire and using them to block major highways. We're talking about buses, trucks, cars, anything that could burn was turned into a roadblock. By Sunday evening, there were reports of 252 separate blockades across the country. But it wasn't just roadblocks. In Puerto Vallarta, one of Mexico's most popular tourist destinations, smoke was billowing across the city as cartel members torched buildings and vehicles. Videos on social media showed people running in panic through the Guadalajara airport. The governor of Jalisco activated what's called a Code Red emergency protocol and suspended all public transportation across the entire state. Guadalajara, the capital of Jalisco and Mexico's second-largest city, turned into a ghost town overnight. Streets that are normally packed with traffic were completely empty. Businesses shut down, schools were canceled. And remember, this is the city that's supposed to host 4 matches in the 2026 World Cup, including games featuring Mexico's national team. The violence spread far beyond Jalisco. Reports were coming in from at least half of Mexico's 32 states. We're talking about Colima, Michoacán, Nayarit, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas. The CJNG's reach was so extensive that they could coordinate attacks across thousands of miles simultaneously. And here's the most disturbing part. This wasn't random violence. This was strategic. The cartel was sending a message that even though their leader was dead, they still had the power to bring an entire country to its knees. They were showing the government and the world that killing El Mencho wouldn't end their organization. The human cost was staggering. By Monday, Mexican authorities confirmed that more than 70 people had died in the operation and its aftermath, according to official statements. 25 members of Mexico's National Guard were killed in 6 separate attacks across Jalisco. 8 CJNG operatives died in the original operation in Tapalpa. But there were also civilian casualties. A jail guard killed during a prison riot in Puerto Vallarta, state prosecutors shot dead in Guadalajara, and others caught in the crossfire across multiple states. Airlines started canceling flights. Delta, Southwest, Alaska Airlines, they all pulled out of affected airports. The U.S. State Department issued travel warnings, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, who had been in office for less than 6 months, suddenly found herself dealing with a crisis that threatened to overshadow everything else her administration had planned. But here's what makes this story even more complicated. The timing couldn't have been worse for Mexico. The country is supposed to host part of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, with Guadalajara scheduled to host 4 group stage matches. We're talking about tens of thousands of international visitors expected in just a few months. And now they're dealing with images of their second-largest city looking like a war zone. The World Cup aspect adds a whole other layer of pressure because Mexico can't afford to look unstable on the world stage. They've been preparing for this tournament for years, and suddenly there are serious questions about whether it's safe for international visitors to travel to one of the host cities. What's even more concerning for Mexican authorities is the question of succession within the CJNG. El Mencho's brother is in a U.S. prison. His son, known as El Menchido, is also in U.S. custody. His daughter has been arrested. There's no clear heir to his criminal empire, which means we could be looking at an internal war between different factions trying to take control. This is exactly what happened when Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was captured. The Sinaloa cartel fractured into competing groups, and the resulting violence was devastating. Security experts are worried that the same thing could happen with the CJNG, except this organization is even more powerful and more violent than the Sinaloa cartel ever was. The international implications are huge, too. The U.S. had been pressuring Mexico to take stronger action against the cartels, especially with the fentanyl crisis killing so many Americans. President Trump had even threatened military action if Mexico couldn't get the situation under control. So, in one sense, El Mencho's death was exactly what the U.S. wanted to see. But the aftermath showed why the kingpin strategy, targeting cartel leaders, is so problematic. Yes, you remove a major criminal figure, but you also risk triggering exactly the kind of chaos we saw across Mexico. It's like cutting the head off a hydra. Sometimes you just end up with multiple heads that are harder to control. The Mexican government tried to put a positive spin on the operation. They called it a major victory and emphasized that it showed their commitment to fighting organized crime. But privately, officials had to be wondering if the cost was worth it. When your biggest law enforcement success triggers nationwide violence and international travel warnings, it's hard to call it an unqualified win. As of now, the situation in Mexico has stabilized somewhat, but the underlying problems haven't gone away. The CJNG still exists, even without its leader. The demand for drugs in the United States hasn't decreased. The economic conditions that drive people toward organized crime haven't improved. And Mexico is still facing the challenge of hosting a World Cup while dealing with ongoing security concerns. What happened on February 22, 2026, will go down as one of the most significant days in Mexico's war against organized crime. The death of El Mencho marked the end of an era. He was the last of the old-school cartel bosses who had built their empires from the ground up. But his death also marked the beginning of a new and potentially more dangerous phase in Mexico's drug war. The question now is what comes next. Will the CJNG fragment into smaller, more manageable groups? Will a new leader emerge to unite them? Or will Mexico face years of violent power struggles as different factions fight for control? What we know for sure is that the death of one man changed everything, and Mexico is still dealing with the consequences. That's it for this episode of What Happened. This story is far from over, and I'll definitely be keeping an eye on how this situation develops, especially with the World Cup coming up. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Mexican government's strategy and whether you think killing cartel leaders actually makes the situation better or worse. If you want to see more videos about major international events and their consequences, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.